Hey, what's up, everyone? GoodMicWork commentaries back at you with your Dark Side of the Ring Season 2 finale, the final days of Owen Hart. We've been waiting for this one ever since the big two-part episode that kicked off the season on the Chris Benoit double murder-suicide, and given how gnarly that episode was and how great all of the other episodes have been so far from Vice, we knew that this Owen Hart documentary was going to be a tough watch. This was going to be very interesting and very eye-opening. We haven't heard from Martha Hart in quite some time. It was going to be our first real look at Owen Hart's kids and was probably going to open up a lot of old wounds, but it was still a story that needed to be told. And as usual, Vice knocked it out of the park. I think it's pretty safe to say, based on the success and the ratings of the first two seasons, that we are likely to see a season 3, and I think we should. I really hope we do, and there's a lot of great potential episodes that they could do in a season 3, and this season we had a lot of great episodes with Chris Benoit and Jimmy Snuka, The Brawl for All, New Jack, Dino Bravo, Herb Abrams, David Schultz. All sorts of really interesting stories were told in season 2, and in the last couple of podcasts we've been speculating on some of the ideas for a potential season 3. Right at the very top of my list would be China. The death of Brian Pillman would also be an excellent one. And also the British Bulldogs, because Dynamite Kid and Davey Boy Smith both have extremely sad endings to their lives. You could make a case for maybe Sunny. A lot of people have mentioned Sunny to me. I've really kind of been against that because I don't think Sunny's story is done being told. She is still dealing with a lot of issues, but when you combine her situation with maybe Chris Candido, that could definitely make for a really interesting, eye-opening, and sad episode. Another sad one would be maybe some of the suicides in wrestling, namely Canyon, who dealt with a lot of issues personally, and he passed away in such a tragic way. The Plane Ride from Hell could be an interesting one that could maybe be in the same light as the Brawl for All in season 2. They could also do one on the steroid scandal back when Vince McMahon went on trial. They touched on Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth in season 1, but I think there is definitely a story to be told on the death of Miss Elizabeth. Still to this day, it's one of the more painful wrestling deaths, and we've dealt with a lot of them, but for me personally, Miss Elizabeth it was all sorts of fucked up, and wrestling didn't deserve to lose her. I think Eddie Graham and Mike Graham have an interesting story to tell, maybe the Ultimate Warrior, Adrian Adonis. And if you have any other ideas, please hit me with them in the comments below. But if we do get a season 3, I'm hoping that we get at least some of those that I just mentioned. But as far as the finale here in season 2, luckily we didn't have to endure an hour and a half of this like we had to with the Chris Benoit tragedy, although I think the Owen Hart episode could have easily been a two-parter. They had to kind of confine this into a 45-minute documentary because it's only an hour long on the Vice channel and you have to factor in commercials. So they couldn't spend a ton of time on everything about Owen's life. They had to gloss over a lot because it was really heavily focused on his final days and what led up to the decision to put him up in that thing and his fall and the aftermath and the lawsuit and all of that. So they only spent the first 15 minutes or so really talking about Owen Hart's life. And that's why I invite you to listen to the podcast I did last year on the 20th anniversary of his death. You'll hear me talk a lot about his career and his early life and my memories of him when he first came into the WWE and all of his great feuds and everything he did with Brett. I get into all of that stuff in my podcast from last year, so please check that out. But in terms of this documentary, they didn't really give us a ton of information that we already knew. I think the value here in this was all of the amazing photos and home videos and footage that they had of Owen Hart. These are things that none of us have ever seen before. Some really cool photos of Owen as a kid working out and outside of his house. And then, of course, with Martha and all of the family photos with the kids and a lot of home movies when they were at Disney World and random places, airports or whatever, just to see Owen and see him interact with his kids was extremely heartwarming. And as a youngster, man, I mean, there's a lot of young Owen Hart pictures that exist out there, but none of these pictures in this documentary I had really seen before. A couple of the pictures of the family I think I had seen, but most every individual picture of Owen that they used was the first time I had ever seen it. So that was really cool. And I loved Chris Jericho saying something about Owen Hart that I've always felt, and I've mentioned it multiple times on the channel before. I'm a big fan of the Karate Kid movies, and they've even resurrected the cast and crew in the Cobra Kai series on YouTube, which I'm still desperately waiting for season 3 to come out. But I've always thought that Owen Hart looks like Johnny from the Karate Kid. He looks like William Zabka. They look a lot alike. Owen's just a little bit bigger, and I've said that more than once. And so for Jericho to mention that on the podcast brought a huge smile to my face, because Owen did look like him. He was a good-looking guy. I can totally see what Martha saw in him. The dude was a stud. So it was really nice to kind of see a lot of that old footage and see Owen Hart in his family setting, and to see Owen Hart with the Harts at the Hart house growing up and all that stuff. So I couldn't get enough of that. I kind of wish they would have included more. Around this time, Martha Hart is introduced, and that's when they were showing a lot of these home movies. And this is really the first interview I've seen with Martha Hart in a long time. They did a documentary way back in the day. I think it was on A&E, and they even included it in the Wrestling with Shadows DVD that I own as an extra, and it was the life and death of Owen Hart. And this was done, I think, maybe just 2 years, maybe 3 years after he passed away, but that was pretty well done as well, and it did a really good job of telling the story of his death and how fucked up it was. And that was really the last time I saw Martha talking about this situation. She told a lot of fun stories in that, and she kind of told the story of how she found out that he died, and it was all very, very sad. So it's been close to, 15 years, probably more, since that came out. And that's the last time I really remember seeing Martha Hart in an interview setting talking about this stuff. They've been very busy. The whole family has been with the Owen Hart Foundation, and I've seen pictures of her throughout the years with various celebrities like Robin Williams and a few other people that she's recently mentioned, along with the kids. And I've seen pictures of Oj and Athena from time to time, but never really gotten to know who they are, never listened, never even heard their voices before. And I was curious, out of respect to Owen, because we all knew, we heard stories how much he loved his family. So for the last, nearly 2 decades, I've been very curious about how his kids have turned out, what they've grown up to be. And I can tell you right now, based on what we saw in this documentary, Owen Hart would be extremely proud of his kids. And I had always heard that they were doing well, and they were well-schooled and everything, but Oj is a lawyer, apparently, and Athena is into journalism, and they're both extremely successful, and they are very involved in the Owen Hart Foundation. They both have memories of their dad, although Athena doesn't have that many because she was really young, but Oj has a lot because he was at that age that memories were starting to form, and it was heartbreaking to listen to him tell stories of his memories of his dad. And Oj's love for train sets, and there was some big convention that he wanted to go to, and Owen told WWE that he's not coming to work because he has to be there with his son, and that echoes a lot of what we already knew about Owen, that the only thing he gave a shit about at all was to have money and to buy a piece of dirt, build a house, raise his family, and that's it. They even showed a clip of some family footage. I think they were in an airport, and Owen was a little bit disgruntled about having to get on an airplane. He goes, well, hopefully this will all be over one day, and I can just have some money, and I can be with my family. Oj even had a really eerie memory of the last time he saw Owen when he was leaving for Kansas City to go to Over the Edge, and he gave him a hug and kiss and said, take care of your mom and your sister. Probably something he said to him every time he left on a trip, but this time it was for real, and this time it was like saying goodbye. So having to hear all of that is just heartbreaking, and these kids had to grow up, without him. And I think I've said this so many times because Owen Hart is a subject that we've covered hundreds of times here on the channel. This is not the first time I've talked about him. As a matter of fact, last year when I did the big podcast on the 20th anniversary, that was me putting the whole issue to bed. I even said that I'm probably not going to talk about him much anymore because I've talked about him so much. And here we are a year later, and we have a brand new documentary released on his death, and I'm like, well, I guess I got to talk about him again. But I'm glad I am, because I don't ever want Owen Hart to be forgotten. It's just, having to revisit his death so many times does get a little draining and a little taxing, on the emotions and stuff. And it's still something that haunts me, because I have memories. I was watching Over the Edge on pay-per-view. I still have it on video, recorded directly off pay-per-view, with Jim Ross making that painful announcement to all of us. I'll never forget that shit. It is sandblasted on my brain. So with all of that going on in my head as a wrestling fan, I can only imagine what his family has had to endure over the years. They talked a little bit about when Owen signed with the WWE initially and was brought in. as the Blue Blazer, and they discussed a little bit of that. They also touched on the great feud that he had a couple of years later when he would get to work with Bret Hart, and the great match they had at WrestleMania 10 in Madison Square Garden. Jim Ross put that match over huge. Martha Hart talks about what she remembers of it and how it got Owen Hart on the map and really elevated him on the card. But the flip side of that just meant that he was going to have to be working even more because now he's got a higher up spot. But that also meant that the money increased for him as well. They talked about the Montreal Screwjob next, and this is, again, something that I've talked about in depth a lot throughout the years. As a matter of fact, I'll put any Screwjob related videos up in the upper right of the screen there as well. And I've said for years about the Montreal Screwjob that not only was the Screwjob itself bad because of what happened to Bret and him having to leave WWE, and then what it did to a big Bret Hart fangirl like myself, who was devastated to find out that he got fucked over and he's now going down south to WCW, to a promotion I hate. All of that was bad enough, but when you fast forward a couple of years and Owen Hart dies, you realize the chain of events that was set in motion that night that really did contribute and lead to Owen Hart dying. I've maintained for years that had Vince and Bret Hart just come to some sort of a fucking agreement to where the Screwjob was not necessary, even if Bret Hart left, things could still have potentially been different if he would have left on good terms. But if the Screwjob just never would have happened in general and Bret Hart would have stayed in the company, there is no way Owen Hart would have been in the Blue Blazer getup. They never would have had that idea for him. He never would have been up on the catwalk, and he never would have fell. Now, it's nobody's fault. Nobody could foresee the future 18 months later, but it's frustrating when you think about it. You know, how many lives were so fucking ruined the night of that Screwjob because Bret and Vince and Shawn and everybody else involved in that just couldn't figure it out. So it's just, it's frustrating when you think about how many different things could have been done to prevent this. And another thing that could have been done to prevent it is what they talked about in the documentary. Jim Cornette and Jim Ross, both in the documentary, were kind of voicing a little bit of frustration with how the creative team couldn't figure out a way to utilize a great wrestler like Owen Hart. During that time in the WWE, everybody needed a gimmick. Everybody had to have some sort of an over-the-top character, and they did discuss the Deborah angle. I wasn't sure if they were going to bring this up, but there's been a lot of talk over the years that Owen Hart was put in the Blue Blazer gimmick because he turned down doing an affair with Deborah, because he's got young kids at home and he doesn't want them to see their dad on TV making out with some other woman. So he turned it down, and that caused the creative team to come up with this idea for him instead. Whether that was Russo or Ferrara or a combination of both or whatever was done there, it was completely unnecessary. And it really frustrates traditionalists like Jim Ross, like Cornette, like a fan like me, who has so much love and respect for the Hart family, and you're going to put Owen up in that silly costume. That's what he used when he came in, when he was kind of a nameless type of guy. Yeah, he was a Hart kid, but he hadn't had a track record yet, and I could understand the Blue Blazer in 1988. But here we are. Owen Hart has now had a long run as Owen Hart. He's been Intercontinental Champion, Tag Team Champion. He's won big matches at WrestleMania. Everybody knows who he is. If you put even 1 ounce of effort into him creatively at all, he can contend for a world title, and you dress him up in this shit. It was silly. They didn't need to do all of this stuff with him. And I remember around that time being a little bit frustrated with Owen's career too. I wasn't into the Jeff Jarrett tag team. I just personally didn't like it. I thought they both, honestly, could have been used better. And even though they made a pretty good tag team, because they are both, second generation guys, they're both veterans together, and they're cagey heels at the same time. So together they can make a really good team. I just personally wasn't into it. I wanted more for Owen. I wanted to see Owen, as a heel, maybe build himself back up a little bit so he could have been a contender for Austin. They had a lot of unfinished business and a lot of history from the previous year with the SummerSlam pile driver. And since Austin was working with guys like Foley, Owen could have easily been in there to be a pay-per-view opponent for him at Unforgiven or at Over the Edge 1998. So as a fan, I always just felt like Owen Hart deserved better. And I felt a little bit validated watching this documentary to hear Jim Ross and Jim Cornette say a lot of the same things about him. And a lot of that it was just a product of the time. Like, that's what was going on in the Attitude Era then. Everything had to be over the top. Everything had to be salacious. Everything had to be silly. And that's why Owen Hart was coming down the ceiling to begin with, was to be silly. And speaking of being suspended from the ceiling and all of the rigging and all of that, they focused a lot on that as well. And Martha Hart tells a story about receiving a phone call at home when she was getting ready to go pick up Owen Hart from the airport, returning home from a road trip. And it was somebody from the WWF who wanted Owen to give his measurements so they could fit the harness for him or whatever. And Martha was like, he just came from you guys. He's coming home. He was just on the road. Why didn't you get it from him last night at the arena? And whoever she was on the phone with said, well, they just decided that they're going to do this now. They just wrote it into the pay-per-view. They also had Jimmy Korderas, which was crazy. Didn't even think about him. He was the referee that was in the ring when Owen fell. Owen basically landed on him. And he talked about his experience of being the ref for the match. And he was just going through his normal routine in the ring when the lights were out and the promo was playing. And this is when the fall happened. And they had a lot of people describing their reaction to Owen Hart's fall. You had D'Lo Brown. You had the Godfather. You had Jim Ross, who was there. Jim Ross said that he kind of got a nudge from Jerry Lawler right at the last minute, and he just looked up right as Owen had hit the ring. And we also heard in the documentary another story that we've heard before. We've heard from Jimmy Korderas, and I think I've heard from somebody else, that Owen Hart was yelling as he was falling, saying, get out of the way or look out, look out. And they mentioned this in the documentary. You know, Jim Cornette's like, imagine that. You know, imagine you're falling and you know you're done. You're not going to live through this, and your last act is to at least try to save anybody that might be below you. And that's a hard thing to hear. And Jimmy Korderas didn't know what hit him. He kind of got struck on the back of the head and kind of moved around a little bit, and then he looked down to see Owen Hart laying there. And where Owen fell, you know, the story is, even though no footage of this exists, I think it did, and WWE either destroyed it or it's under lock and key. But he landed in the corner, so he kind of like hit the ring post and the turnbuckle and the referee, all in that little area there. I don't know which part of his body hit first, his chest, his legs, whatever. But basically, I think the cause of death was severing of the aorta. I think one of his bones or collarbone or something broke, punctured the aorta, body cavity filled up with blood, and he was done in a matter of minutes. And it's just a horrible way to go. And everybody had to watch this, and it's on pay-per-view. And as a fan, I'll never forget kind of knowing it wasn't good when Jerry Lawler kind of came back to the announce desk, because he got up right away. A lot of the pictures that you see in the newspapers and stuff of the EMTs working on Owen, you see Lawler in a lot of those. So he got right up off headset and walked over there to try to find out what's going on while Jim Ross stayed put. I remember when Lawler came back to the commentary booth, and he kind of, I think he put the headset back on, and he just said a really grim line like, it doesn't look good at all. And I think that was the moment as a fan that I knew that this was absolutely horrible, because to see King with that type of look on his face, he looked white as a ghost, and he knew, I think, that that was it for Owen. D'Lo Brown, actually, he might have been mistaken in the documentary, because he was describing Owen Hart when they were bringing him back, and he said that Lawler came through the curtain and was like, I don't think he's going to make it, or I don't think he's alive, or something like that. But I don't think Lawler went through the curtain. I don't think Lawler left ringside and walked all the way back to Gorilla. I think he just stayed at ringside to watch what the EMTs were doing and then returned to the commentary booth. So D'Lo might have been mistaken there. I don't know. But backstage was chaotic because they had to wheel Owen past a lot of people. And I think Godfather said he would just look purple. He looked blue. And you just knew it was bad. You had to watch Jeff Jarrett and Deborah and Kevin Kelly then perform an interview mere seconds after Owen Hart just wheeled past them on a stretcher, fighting for his life. At that point, he was probably clinically dead anyway. And Jeff Jarrett's fighting back tears, and Deborah's a mess. And everybody just has to go on with the show. You know, Jim Ross, poor Jim Ross, tells the story, and he's always had difficulty talking about this. And he said that because he never left the ringside area, that Kevin Dunn was the one that let him know in his earpiece that Owen Hart was dead. But Jim Ross didn't know that Owen was dead, and Kevin Dunn assumed that he did. And he goes, all right, JR, we need you to give an update to the fans. And Jim Ross says, well, what is the update? And Kevin Dunn said, oh, I'm sorry, I thought you knew. The update is Owen Hart is dead. By the way, we're live in 10 seconds. So Jim Ross, the announcement that he made to all of us was basically fresh. You know, he had just found this information out a mere seconds prior, and then he has to inform millions of people at home on pay-per-view. And there's only a handful of things in the wrestling business that are really, really eerie, that no matter how many times you see it or hear it, it just makes your heart sink. And there's something about that announcement from Jim Ross that just, it just opens up a hole in your gut. I can't even describe it. One of the hardest things to see in this episode was Jim Cornette breaking down. I'm no fan of Jim Cornette right now. I think he's got a couple of marbles loose up there with some of the things that he's been saying and how dated and crazy and outright offensive a lot of his comments can be these days. And to see some hard ass like him actually breaking down, because he knew Owen. He managed Owen. He had a great relationship with Owen. He's one of the best people to listen to when it comes to Owen Hart stories and rib stories. Cornette has got a million of them. And Martha then has to tell the painful story, retell the painful story about how she found out in the phone call that she got first from Vince McMahon. He was the first person to call her, letting her know at that time that Owen had fallen. He didn't say that he had died. I think at that time they didn't really know, but he said that it was bad and that she's going to be getting a call from a doctor very soon. Right after that was when the doctor called her, and this is the story that she told in the documentary from, 15 years ago. She said that the doctor was kind of leading her on a little bit, and she had to cut him off because he was like, normally we would fly you in to tell you news like this. And she's like, just get to the conclusion. What are you trying to tell me here? And he said, Mrs. Hart, I'm so sorry to tell you that your husband has died. And, she said she slumped over. She just screamed. She didn't know what to do. Poor Oj, who I think was in the house, told the story of how he saw his mom upset. And she was saying, what am I going to do now? And really just an emotional wreck. And she had to then break the news to his kids that Dad has died. He didn't feel any pain. It was very fast, but he's gone now. He said that they all slept in the same bed that night, which just breaks your heart. So you really feel for Martha when you have to hear her tell these stories and how agonizing that must have been. And she told another very grim story about how she had to see Owen for the first time at the funeral in the casket and how kind of bad he looked, how different he looked, and how she was really scared to kind of even go up to him. She said Brett was there, and she kind of inched closer and closer, and then she kind of snapped out of it and was able to touch him and all of that. She goes, if I loved him in life, I'm going to love him in death. And, she kind of wept and cried over him, and that's just, it's just heartbreaking to even hear her have to talk about that type of stuff. So the funeral was huge. We've seen various pictures over the years of the funeral. Even WWE went against Martha's wishes and showed footage of the funeral on their TV show on Monday Night Raw the following week after Owen Hart passed away. And I think Martha was none too pleased about that, but that's really all we've seen of the funeral aside from a few pictures. There's one really awesome picture with Bret Hart and Hulk Hogan and Chris Benoit and Terry Funk. So we've seen photos of the funeral before. I do think there was a really interesting video of Hulk Hogan and Vince McMahon coming face to face for the first time in years, and they shook hands. That was also shown in the past, but we've never really heard any other details about it. And Martha Hart said there were so many people there that they couldn't let everybody in the church, and they had to pipe in the eulogies and everything over the loudspeakers to the people that were standing outside. So there were just thousands of people there turning out to show support for Owen and the entire Hart family. Once the funeral was over, Martha meant business. She even said in Owen Hart's eulogy that there will be a day of reckoning. She vowed that. So that became her primary focus. Martha wanted to find out what happened that night. She wanted to retrace his steps, and she even told the story of how not only did she go to Kemper Arena, she brought the kids with her, and all three of them, I could not believe this. This blew my mind. All three of them walked up to the catwalk, walked up to the very spot that Owen fell. She wanted her kids to see that. She wanted them to have no questions growing up. And that's a ballsy move for a mother to make, especially given their age. But, looking back, I think she made the right decision. Props to her for being real and making her kids deal with this head on. This is what happened to your dad. He fell from here. He died. You need to know this. If I'm in her shoes, I don't know if I'm making that decision, but it's what she wanted to do. She started digging around. She investigated the rigging company. She wanted to know the equipment and what was used and who was involved. She even pulled out and showed the actual clip that he was wearing when he died. that only required, I think she said, 6 pounds of pressure to release the clip. And apparently it's a contraption that's normally used for sailboats, and Martha argued that it was grossly inadequate. And the story that she tells is that it wasn't the normal clip that they used. They had actually switched it to something that was a little bit easier because WWE didn't want Owen Hart to be spending too much time getting out of the harness when he landed in the ring. They wanted it to be fast and without any clunkiness of trying to get out of the outfit. So she's basically saying this was all done just to save a couple of seconds of time. Clearly, there was some serious negligence here. And, Martha, too, she talked about the rigging company. She said that they were really well renowned. They had done rigging for the Rolling Stones, for Elton John, for Disney. She basically says they're one of the best companies, but then also says WWE didn't hire the best. It's likely a combination of so many things, and my biggest issue is, not only what went wrong, how did Owen Hart get released? What led to that? Was it inadequate or not? Could they have done a better job of being safer? There's arguments to be made about all of that. My argument as a wrestling fan just goes much simpler. I basically ask myself every day, why the fuck was he up there to begin with, kind of thing. So none of that would have happened if he just wouldn't have been put up there from a creative standpoint. After that, it's all on the riggers and it's all on whatever happened that allowed him to fall off of there. People have speculated over the years because he was wearing the Blues Blazer costume and he had a cape and feathers and a mask on that something could have gotten caught and released him. Whatever happened, it literally seems like 100 things could have been done differently to prevent it. And Martha talked a lot about the lawsuit as well, talked about Vince McMahon also suing her. She did discuss this on Talk is Jericho last week. She talked about Vince McMahon wanting to move the trial to Connecticut because Connecticut does not award punitive damages. She also talked about the division and the Hart family, and I think that's something that really needs to be talked about because the Hart family really imploded after all of this happened. She wanted justice for her family, but at the same time, there's a lot of people in the Hart family that may need to rely on the WWE for jobs. And Martha this week also did an interview with Forbes where she discussed Owen Hart in the Hall of Fame and how she gave her reasons as to why she will never allow him to be honored into the WWE Hall of Fame because it's a fake Hall of Fame. It's not even really real. And she has an excellent point about that. As a wrestling fan, I'm willing to accept that it is her call, it's her family's call, and I'm not about to tell them what to do. And another thing that she said in that was really interesting was her relationship with Bret Hart and how that kind of fell apart. Because I remember at first, he was right by her side. He was side by side with her when she was interviewed by Larry King. I remember watching that at home just a few days after his death. And Bret Hart seemed to really have her back. But things changed as the lawsuit progressed, and she did tell a pretty unflattering story about Bret. That doesn't surprise me. We've heard this multiple times from Bret. He has been hell-bent on gaining access to his footage in the WWE. He wants the rights to his library, his tape library. He wants to be able to use the footage, and he's tried to get this from Vince several times, even after the screw job. When they had met when Owen died in the park, it was one of the first things he said. He has always wanted his footage. So he may have been backing up Martha thinking this is a way to get it. And she said that Bret Hart asked her, hey, when we're asking for things in the settlement, let's see if we can get my footage. But when he realized that wasn't going to be possible, he decided to repair his relationship with Vince McMahon, and that's when he came in 2003, I think it was, to do the DVD, and then, or 2005 maybe, and then by 2006, he was in the WWE Hall of Fame. So that's pretty fucked up, that Bret Hart kind of abandoned her just because he might have only been with her to begin with because he thought that maybe he could get his footage out of this lawsuit or something. That's a little, I don't know what to say about that. But, that's the way the Hart family is. Bret Hart himself has had issues with people, giving shit to some of his sisters before who were trying to get their husbands' jobs back in the WWE. So the Hart family motivation, some of it is well-intentioned, and then some of it is based on greed and personal interests and stuff. So there were probably some Hart family members that said, hey, if we back you in this lawsuit, we're not going to be able to, use WWE as a source of income or employment in the future. So it created a tight spot for everybody. But, I would think, being Owen Hart's family, that you should back Martha, but a lot of the Hart family do consider it to be an accident, which it was. You know, a lot of Owen's friends and everything. It's not like everybody quit WWE in disgust. They continued to work there. Jericho, who narrated this documentary, went on to work for WWE for years. He showed up in the WWE 3 months after Owen died. So people understand that it's an accident, but when it comes to Martha and her feelings and the fact that her husband was taken away from her, you know, you can't really blame her for any of this, in my opinion. And it was really hard to hear Owen's son, Oj, echo a lot of what I've been saying for years and what I've said a couple of times in this episode already, and that is that this death was preventable. There were so many things, from a creative standpoint, not even having Owen go up there to begin with, from a rigging standpoint. Who knows what could have been changed that day, but literally one little thing could have been changed that could have set in motion a whole course of events that would keep Owen Hart alive and have him here to this day, as a retired old man hanging out with his family. Him and Martha in an empty nest now with the kids out on their own, successful, enjoying the fruits of his labor and knowing he accomplished exactly what he set out to do, provide for him and his family. So he left Martha behind and the kids with this horrible accident, and she did a great job. She brought those kids up right. She raised them right. She took that money in the settlement, which Jericho revealed in the documentary was for $18 million. I think we have heard that number mentioned before. And she did good with it, creating the Owen Hart Foundation, which has helped so many people. And Oj brings up a good point in the documentary. At the very end of this, they talked about Owen Hart going into the Hall of Fame, and he said, no, he's not going to go in. If you want to honor Owen, that's what the Owen Hart Foundation is for. And he's 100% right, because that's a real, tangible thing. That's an actual charity that helps people, that does good. So as a wrestling fan, you can't be an asshole and be like, oh, put him in the WWE Hall of Fame. If you want to honor Owen, go make a donation to the Owen Hart Foundation. Go on Pro Wrestling Tees right now. They've got an Owen Hart store. Martha Hart has released 2 T-shirts for Owen Hart that you can support him, and all the money goes right to the foundation. So as a wrestling fan, you know, for me, I can live with him not going into the Hall of Fame. Yes, the fan in me would love him to be remembered, but these are very different circumstances, and I think that if you can't put yourself in somebody else's shoes and be able to see it from their perspective, then you have no point even bringing up any discussion here, because you're thinking from a completely selfish point of view. This is something that just flat out should not have happened. I put on Twitter right after the documentary that if I could find a DeLorean, if I could find Doc Brown and Marty McFly's time machine, my very first stop would be May 23rd, 1999, Kansas City, fucking Missouri. And I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure Owen Hart doesn't go up on that fucking catwalk. And in the past, every time I've spoken about Owen, I always have a little bit of this underlying anger because it's so frustrating that it even happened to begin with. We have to deal with enough tragedies in wrestling. We have to deal with enough needless deaths. The last thing we need are deaths that are so ridiculously preventable. And Owen Hart's family has every right to never get over this. Now, Martha Hart has said that she's forgiven WWE, that she's let it go, and she doesn't want to let it consume her, but that doesn't mean she ever wants to do business with them. She said if they want to donate to the foundation, that's great. They're more than welcome to. She would welcome a donation from them. But in terms of them capitalizing and making money on his Hall of Fame, you know, because the Hall of Fame is something that they put on TV, they sell advertising for, they sell tickets for, and she says no, it's not going to happen. And you know what? That's okay. I would hope that after this documentary, maybe some of the more critical fans that are always on the case of Martha Hart, maybe they have just a little bit more of a different perspective now after seeing this, and maybe they can at least try to see her point. You know, because there's a lot of things you can debate about the Owen Hart death. Not canceling the show is another one, and I've made my feelings known on that. I think at the time, I was not in support of it, but I guess I was kind of cutting WWE some slack because, you know, shit, what are you supposed to do? It's pay-per-view. If this was a house show, absolutely, there's no way the show would be going on. But in a pay-per-view situation, it's really never happened before. They reacted the way they did. If they had to do it again, they probably would react differently. So I can almost cut them some slack, but that doesn't mean that I think the show should have continued. I've said this before too. If I'm backstage, if I'm Vince McMahon, if I have any sort of decision-making power whatsoever, that show is ending the minute Owen fell and everybody's going home. And Martha even brings that up in the documentary. This is a potential crime scene. You know, at the time, I remember even in the hotline reports and stuff, they weren't ruling out homicide, that he was pushed off or killed. So if that's the case, if that's even a possibility, everybody must leave the arena and you must investigate. But that didn't happen. The show was allowed to go on for another hour and a half until they got the fans out of there. That's pretty fucked up when you look back on it. So I've always felt, in hindsight anyway, even though I'm not going to crucify the WWE because they can't go back and change it. If they could, I'm sure they would. But I am really surprised that after somebody dies like that right in the ring in front of 18,000 people, that you still go on with the show and you do a title change and you do everything that you did. And everybody's got to go out there and just go through the motions. Have any of you ever watched Over the Edge after Owen Hart fell? I hate to even do it. I never watch it. But those matches were boring. The wrestlers were they were zombies out there. Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler were trying to do things on commentary, but they knew Owen was dead, and it was just uncomfortable. I cannot believe that they did that. I still can't believe it. But anyway, no need and no point in harping on all of that. Point is, this was a really well-done documentary. I thoroughly enjoyed the season finale of Dark Side of the Ring for Season 2, and I'm sure we are going to see some great things in a potential Season 3. I really hope that they do one because there are many more stories to be told. And I knew this one was going to be tough to watch and tough to get through, but we made it. We made it to the end, and I'm glad Season 2 is over. It was a rough road this time around. So anyway, feel free to leave me all of your comments on this documentary below. Let me know any memories you would like to share of Owen Hart. I always love reading that type of stuff, so if you have a favorite match of his or a favorite moment, or you just want to discuss him in general, please let me know down in the comments below. And like I said, check out my Owen Hart Tribute podcast from last year. There's lots of good Owen information in that as well, and lots to take in and process. I want to thank you guys very, very much for joining me on this review. I have premiered this video, so if you've been watching live this whole time on YouTube and commenting in the chat, I appreciate you joining in live for this one. Don't forget to check back on the channel this coming Friday, immediately after SmackDown, for Double or Nothing predictions, and then Saturday night, immediately following AEW Double or Nothing, I'll be up here for a review. You guys take care, have a great rest of your night, and I'll talk to you real soon. Long live Owen Hart.